The night Bryn Callahan dropped a tray of champagne flutes in front of the most dangerous man in Vancouver, she thought it was the worst moment of her life. She was wrong. The worst moment came 40 seconds later, when a man the size of a shipping container kicked in the hotel ballroom doors and turned a black-tie charity gala into a killing floor. But the moment everyone would talk about, the moment that made the papers, the podcasts, the hushed conversations in corner offices across the city, was the one nobody saw coming. The moment the clumsy coat check girl from East Vancouver, the one who'd apologized 3 times in the last hour, stepped between a professional killer and his target and stopped him with her bare hands. Julian Caruso didn't just attend charity galas, he curated them. The Pacific Children's Foundation Gala at the Harbor Grand Hotel was technically a fundraiser. In practice, it was a performance, the kind where powerful men wrote checks large enough to buy forgiveness for things money shouldn't be able to forgive, and everyone smiled at each other over glasses of Blanc de Blanc and pretended the world made sense. Caruso sat at the center table, naturally. Not because he'd paid for it, though he had. $300,000 bought you the round table beneath the Venetian chandelier, the one that cast everyone in amber light and made them look like they belonged in a Renaissance painting. He sat there because rooms like this organized themselves around men like him. Even people who didn't know his name sensed the gravity. He was 61, compact and precise in a way that suggested nothing in his life had ever been accidental. His tuxedo was black Brioni, custom-fitted. His silver cufflinks were engraved with a family crest so old most historians had forgotten what it stood for. His hair was steel gray and perfectly placed, and his eyes, dark, watchful, still, moved across the room the way a security camera moves, catching everything. Reacting to nothing, around him sat the usual constellation. A provincial cabinet minister who laughed too readily. A crown prosecutor whose wife touched his arm every time Caruso spoke. A real estate developer who'd flown in from Calgary specifically to be photographed in this man's company. They were accomplished people who had become, in his presence, an audience. That's when Bryn appeared. Bryn Callahan materialized at the edge of table 7 carrying a tray of canapes that was, objectively, too large for one person to manage. She was 28, slight, with dark hair pinned back in a way that made her look younger than she was. And she moved through the room with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly how much this job mattered. She needed it to matter. Her mother's dialysis treatments were $1,200 a month. Her brother was 18 and halfway through his first semester at SFU on a scholarship that covered tuition, but not textbooks, not rent, not the 1,000 small costs of surviving in Vancouver while being poor. Bryn had been working 3 jobs since she was 19. This one, event hospitality at the Harbor Grand, paid $34 an hour, plus gratuities from guests who sometimes tipped badly and sometimes tipped like they were trying to ease a conscience. She approached table 7 with the tray balanced and her expression neutral and professional, and then her foot caught the edge of the carpet runner. The seam had been folded slightly, barely a centimeter of fabric, invisible in the low light. Her left foot caught it mid-stride, and she stumbled, not falling, catching herself. But the tray tilted, and 2 champagne flutes slid off the edge and shattered on the marble floor with a sound that cut through the string quartet like a blade. The room didn't go quiet. Rooms full of powerful people don't go quiet for a dropped glass. But table 7 did. Every head turned. The cabinet minister's laugh died in his throat. The prosecutor's wife stopped mid-sip. Caruso looked at her, not the way most people look at hospitality staff, through them, past them, cataloguing their existence as furniture. He looked at her the way he looked at everything. Directly, completely, as if she were a variable he hadn't yet assigned a value to. "I'm so sorry," Bryn said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'll have someone clean that up immediately. Are you hurt?" Caruso asked. The question surprised her. It surprised everyone at the table. "No, sir, I'm fine. I'm so sorry for the disruption." "You caught the tray," he said. Not a compliment, exactly, an observation. Faster than most people would have. "I've had practice," she said, which was true in more ways than she meant. She'd been catching things her whole life. Caruso studied her for one more second, then returned his attention to his table as if the moment had never happened. His voice, when he spoke to his guests again, was unhurried. "The salmon, if you don't mind," he said to the air, which meant her. Bryn exhaled and went to get someone with a broom. She didn't see the way Caruso's security lead, a broad-shouldered man named Derek who stood near the room's east pillar, watched the exchange with a slight frown. Didn't see him lift 2 fingers to his earpiece, a quick double tap that meant nothing to anyone watching and everything to the man on the other end. She didn't know she'd just been noticed by the wrong people. She would find out in about 14 minutes. The doors didn't give warning, they simply ceased to exist. Both sets of the ballroom's east entrance detonated inward simultaneously, Not from a charge, but from impact, from a body moving at a velocity that human beings weren't supposed to achieve on foot. The ornate brass handles bent on impact. The hinges screamed and gave way, and through the wreckage walked something that Bryn's mind refused, initially, to categorize as a person. His name, she would learn later, was Garrett Pell. He was 6'5" and weighed somewhere north of 280 pounds, and whatever pharmaceutical program had been running through his system for the past 8 hours had reduced him to something that was technically still a man, but practically wasn't. He wore civilian clothes, dark trousers, a grey jacket that had been expensive before he destroyed the seams with his shoulders, and his face was expressionless in a way that was more frightening than rage would have been. Empty, that was the word. Whatever made eyes human had been switched off. Derek moved first. He was good. Former RCMP tactical unit, 8 years in protective services, the kind of professional who ran toward threats while civilians ran away. He stepped into Pell's path with his hand already going inside his jacket. Pell hit him with one arm, a lateral sweep, the way you might brush a coat off a chair. Derek left his feet. He hit the edge of the dessert station and the whole thing came down silver platters, petit fours, a tiered display of macarons, and Derek didn't get up. The second security detail, a younger man posted by the bar, fired once. The sound in the enclosed room was enormous, a flat crack that sent people diving under tables and screaming toward the fire exits. The bullet hit Pell in the shoulder. Pell turned toward the sound, found the shooter, and crossed the room in 3 strides. What happened next was brief and terrible, and the young guard ended up against the wall, sliding slowly down it, not moving. Bryn had been in the service corridor when the doors went. She'd heard the impact, felt it through the floor, and she'd done something that confused her later when she thought about it. She didn't run toward the exit at the end of the corridor. She moved to the door that led back into the ballroom and looked through the porthole window in it, and what she saw made her stomach drop through the floor. Pell was walking toward the center table, toward Caruso, not hurrying. The way you walk toward something that can't escape. Caruso hadn't moved. Bryn could see him from here, still seated, his hands flat on the tablecloth, his face showing something she would not have predicted from a man who controlled half the private security contracts on the West Coast. He looked resolved, not calm, resolved. Like a man who has done the math and accepted the answer. The other guests at his table had scattered. The minister was under a table near the stage. The prosecutor's wife had made it to a pillar and was pressed against it, both hands over her mouth. The room was half Chios, half frozen. The particular mixture of terror that happens when something violent occurs in a place where violence is not supposed to exist. Pell reached inside his jacket and produced a knife that was not a kitchen knife or a hunting knife, but something designed with intent, matte black, serrated on the spine. The kind of blade that meant whoever sent him wanted this to look like something it wasn't. Bryn's hand was on the door before she made the decision to open it. Later, she'd try to explain this and fail. She would say she wasn't brave. She would say she was just tired. Tired of watching things fall apart. Tired of catching everything on her own. Tired of standing in corridors watching while the people who made decisions sat in amber light and accepted their endings without a fight. Maybe some of that was true. What was also true, she'd spent 7 years before this job doing something that no one at the Harbor Grand knew about. Something she'd left behind when her mother got sick and the travel became impossible. The cover story's too complicated to maintain across hospital waiting rooms and dialysis schedules. She opened the door. Hey, her voice cut through the room like the gunshot had. Not loud, louder than that somehow, certain. Pell stopped, turned. She was standing 20 feet from him in her black server's uniform, with the hotel crest on the breast pocket, her hair still pinned back, holding nothing. No weapon, no shield. His expression didn't change. Nothing to process. She was irrelevant. Little girl should move, he said. His voice was wrong, flat, metronomic, like something that had learned to approximate speech, but had never learned why. You've been walking toward that table for 15 seconds, Bryn said. You should have been there by now. She stepped into the room. That means some part of your brain is still functioning. I'm giving it a chance to make the right decision. He charged. She'd known he would. The pharmaceutical profile on this kind of operator, and she'd studied them, back when studying them was her job, meant threat assessment was binary. Either a target or not a target. She'd made herself a target. That was intentional. She dropped into a slide at the last possible moment, going under his reaching arm. And as she came up, she drove her elbow into the back of his knee with everything she had. The joint doesn't care how big the person is. Physics doesn't negotiate. Pell stumbled, one knee dropping, and Bryn used the fractional second to get behind him, to position herself in the geometry that training had made as automatic as breathing. She got her arm around his neck in a configuration that put pressure in the right places, and she held it. He stood up with her hanging off him, which she'd also expected. She was 115 pounds, and he was nearly 3 times that, and he straightened as if she weighed nothing, and she held on. He slammed backward into a support column, trying to crush her. She took the impact in the shoulder and held on. He grabbed her arm and pulled, and she felt something in her wrist go wrong, and she held on. It took 11 seconds. 11 seconds of pure oxygen deprivation to a brain that was already running on chemistry instead of sense. And then the giant's knees went, and he went down, and Bryn rode him to the floor and controlled the descent, and stayed on top of him until she felt the tension go out of his body. He was unconscious. Alive, she'd made sure of that, but done. Bryn stood up, checked her wrist. Sprain may be cracked, she'd find out later. Checked the room, one tactical sweep, old instinct, impossible to unlearn. Exits, angles, unknowns. There were 3 unknowns, and they came through the west entrance that nobody had been watching, because everyone had been watching Pell. They wore plain clothes, and they moved the way people move when they've practiced moving in coordination for a long time. The first one had his hand inside his jacket. The second was already scanning the room for Pell and not finding him where he was supposed to be. The third, the one who hung back slightly, who was watching not the room but Bryn, that was the one she needed to worry about. Caruso was still at the table, still not moving. Bryn crossed the room in 10 steps and put herself between him and the 3 newcomers, and she said it quietly, just for him. "Get behind me and stay there until I tell you to move." "Who are you?" he said. Someone who was very unhappy about the answer to that question right now. She didn't take her eyes off the 3 men. The one in the middle had stopped scanning and was looking at her with an expression that shifted, just slightly, from professional neutral to something approaching recalibration. He hadn't expected this. Nobody had. The one in the back, the watcher, raised something small and dark, and for a moment she thought it was a weapon, and then she recognized it. A radio. A voice came through a speaker mounted somewhere near the ceiling, amplified and calm and careful, with a trace of an accent she couldn't immediately place. Mid-Atlantic, maybe. The kind that gets trained out of you. Mrs. Bryn Callahan, formerly attached to a Federal Protective Intelligence Unit that, as of approximately 2 years ago, no longer officially exists. A pause. "We know your service record. We know your clearance level. We know what you can do. You've just demonstrated it." Another pause. "We're not here for Mr. Caruso. We would like you to step away from him and come with us, and everyone else in this room walks out tonight. If you don't, we start with the guests we have in the lobby." Caruso was very still behind her. "How many?" he said, barely above a whisper. "In the lobby, minimum 6. She was running numbers. The 3 in front of her, plus whoever had Pell on a leash before he came through those doors, plus the lobby contingent. This wasn't improvised. This had been planned around a specific variable, and the variable was her. "Someone burned me," she said, more to herself than to him. "Someone knew I'd be here tonight. The Foundation hired your company 3 weeks ago," Caruso said. "I have the contract. Then someone saw the contract. You're saying I was bait." She didn't answer that. The 3 men hadn't moved. They were waiting, professional patience, the kind that comes from being certain of the outcome. She had maybe 90 seconds before they ran out of it. "What do they want with you?" Caruso asked. "Information I don't have anymore. Records from the unit before it was dissolved. They think I kept copies. Did you? No. Will they believe that?" She didn't answer that either. "There's a service stairwell," Caruso said. "Behind the stage. It goes to the loading dock. I've used it before when I needed to leave events without being photographed. They'll have it covered. The loading dock connects to the underground parkade. My car is there, armored." She processed this. "It's still a 60-foot open run across a loading dock. Yes, in heels. My heels. A beat. I can have that car to the stairwell door in 90 seconds. She glanced at him for the first time. He'd gotten his phone out somehow, was already composing a message with the quiet efficiency of someone who operated in emergencies. His hands were steady. "Behind the stage," she said. "Now. Don't run." They moved. The voice on the speaker said, "Mrs. Callahan." She didn't listen. She was already calculating the route, the angles, the doors. The 3 men started moving when she did, spreading out to cut off the stage approach, and she knew they had maybe 40 seconds before the geometry closed on them. She grabbed a microphone stand from the stage as they passed. Not as a weapon, though she could use it as one. She swung it into the stage lighting board on the wall as they passed, and the ballroom went dark. In the darkness, she found Caruso's sleeve by memory and pulled him forward. The stairwell door was where he said it was. She'd memorized the floor plan when she'd arrived. Again, old habit, impossible to stop, and she found it in the dark without slowing down. They went through it and down, 2 flights, and she could hear feet on the stairs above them before they reached the bottom. The loading dock was cold and lit by sodium yellow industrial lights. She could see the ramp down to the parkade, the heavy metal door at the bottom. And she could see the figure standing near the wall by the door who definitely wasn't a hotel employee. "Stay here," she told Caruso. "That's not. Stay here." She went toward the figure, and the figure pushed off the wall, and they met in the middle of the dock in a collision that was neither slow nor pretty. He was trained. She was better. Not stronger, not faster, but 7 years of operational work produces a quality of situational reading that strength can't replicate. She knew where he was going before he knew himself. She put him down in about 8 seconds and borrowed his radio. The car appeared at the ramp 20 seconds later. Black Suburban, reinforced, the driver's face familiar in the way faces are familiar when you've been moving in the same professional circles long enough. She got Caruso into the back seat, then got in herself, and the car was moving before the door closed. "Drive," she said. The driver drove, in the quiet of the armored interior, with the city sliding past the windows and sirens just beginning to multiply somewhere behind them. Caruso sat with his jacket slightly torn and his cufflinks still perfectly in place, and he looked at her for a long moment. "The champagne glasses," he said finally. She looked at him. "When you stumbled, what about it? You caught the tray. I noticed it because of how you caught it, not the grab itself but the weight redistribution. Your feet moved before your hands did." He paused. "Whoever trained you very well. Canadian federal program," she said. "Close protection and intelligence collection. Disbanded when the political winds shifted." She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. Her wrist was throbbing. "It was a good program. Were you gathering intelligence on me?" The honest answer was not tonight. The more complicated honest answer was, once briefly, in a different operational context, his name had appeared on a list she was asked to assess. She'd closed that file 8 months before she left the program, when the file went cold and the case officer above her moved to another jurisdiction. Julian Caruso was a man who operated at the edge of things, the exact edge where legal and not legal blurred into the gray zone where money lived. He wasn't clean. She knew that. She also knew he wasn't the target of anything that still existed. "No," she said. "But you've seen my name before tonight. Most people in my former line of work have seen your name before tonight." He absorbed this with the equanimity of a man for whom this kind of information was neither surprising nor particularly new. "And yet you stepped between me and that man. I stepped between him and a room full of people. You stepped between him and me specifically." She turned from the window to look at him. "You were the one who wasn't moving. Everyone else ran. You sat there and waited for it." Something moved across his face. Just briefly. Something unguarded. "There didn't seem to be a point in running. That's the most fatalistic thing I've heard from someone who's survived 60 years in your industry." 61, he said. "More reason." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city lights blurred by. "May I ask you something? I can't stop you. Why did you go back into that room? You were in the service corridor. You had a clear path to the exit." Bryn thought about her mother, who had spent 20 years making choices that kept other people safe, a nurse on a floor where the work was invisible and the stakes were everything. She thought about her brother, who was the first person in their family to sit in a university classroom and who called her every Sunday, even though she never had anything interesting to say. She thought about the 300 people in that ballroom who'd come to raise money for sick children and had instead been introduced to the worst version of the world. "I've been catching things my whole life," she said. "It's just what I do." He looked at her for a long time after that. Not the way he'd looked at her when she dropped the glasses, assessing, cataloging, but something different, like a man revising an equation he thought he'd already solved. "The voice on the speaker said they want information," he said. "Records from your former unit. Records I don't have, but they don't know that, no. Which means they'll try again." She'd been aware of this since the loading dock. "Yes, I have resources," he said, and his voice was careful, precise in the way it got when he was proposing something he'd already thought through. "Legal ones, mostly, and some that are adjacent to legal, which I'm aware is not a selling point from your perspective." He looked at his hands. "But I also have motivation. Someone used my guest list, my venue, my foundation to get access to you. I'd like to know who, so would I. Then we have aligned interests." "We have one aligned interest," she said. "Let's not oversell it." The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but adjacent to it, crossed his face. "Fair enough." The Suburban moved through downtown Vancouver and toward the water, and behind them the sirens were getting quieter, or maybe they were just moving faster. Bryn watched the city and pressed her sore wrist against her knee and thought about phone calls she needed to make. To her mother's care coordinator, to her brother, to a former colleague in Ottawa who might still have access to channels that no longer officially existed. She thought about the man sitting 3 feet from her, who controlled things she didn't entirely understand and had spent 61 years doing it, and who had sat at his table and prepared to die with a stillness that was either profound courage or profound exhaustion or both. "You could have moved," she said quietly, not looking at him, "when Pell came through those doors. There were 5 seconds before he reached your table. You could have been under it, behind the stage, anywhere. Yes, why didn't you?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "My wife died 11 years ago," he said finally. "There was a man, a threat, from a business dispute that had become something more personal, and I had been warned, and I had made arrangements to protect her, and the arrangements were not enough." His voice didn't waver. "She didn't run when she should have. I've always thought she stayed because she didn't want to look afraid. Because looking afraid, in the world we moved in, had costs." He looked at the city passing outside. "I've spent 11 years wondering if I taught her that, if the world I built around us was the thing that killed her." Bryn didn't say anything. "So when that man walked toward me tonight," Caruso said, "I made a decision that it wasn't going to be a chair or a table that my obituary was about, that it was going to be what I actually am. However complicated that is, that's a very expensive way to make a point to yourself," Bryn said. "Yes, it is." He looked at her. "You can add that to the list of my bad decisions." The driver took an exit off the bridge, and they were in a part of the city that was quieter, residential, the kind of neighborhood where money lived quietly. Bryn's phone was buzzing in her pocket, the hotel probably, or the police, or someone who'd seen something and traced the number on her company's contract. She would have to answer all of it eventually. "Drop me at Main and 8th, she said to the driver. "I can take you wherever you need to go," Caruso said. "Main and 8th is where I need to go." Her mother's care home was 4 blocks from that corner. She needed to see for herself that the facility was secure, that whatever tonight had been was contained to tonight and hadn't followed her home. It was probably fine. It was almost certainly fine, but she would not sleep without checking. The car slowed. "The information they think you have," Caruso said. "If it doesn't exist, it doesn't, then the only way to make them stop looking for it is to surface whoever told them it did. That's my problem. You made my problem yours tonight." He looked at her steadily. "Consider allowing the reverse." She opened the car door. The night air came in, cool and damp, the smell of the city after a rain that had fallen while they were inside being shot at. "I'll think about it," she said. She got out. The door closed. The Suburban sat there for a moment, and then it moved away into the dark, and Bryn stood on the corner in her torn server's uniform with her aching wrist and her ruined shift, and the weight of a night that was going to have a very long tail. She walked the 4 blocks to her mother's care home, checked in at the desk, walked the corridor to room 12, stood in the doorway for a long moment watching the rise and fall of her mother's chest in the low light, listening to the steady rhythm of the machine that supplemented what her kidneys could no longer do on their own. Then she walked back out into the Vancouver night and started making phone calls. She had a name in her head, the kind that surfaces when you've been operational long enough, and a specific type of operation happens and you run the variables backward, the kind of name that makes you close your eyes for a moment before you dial. Because once you start pulling that thread, the sweater unravels in directions you can't predict. She dialed. The city hummed around her, indifferent and enormous, full of people who'd been at home tonight, safe and unaware, while a woman they'd never know had stood in a chandelier ballroom and chosen, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, to step toward the thing everyone else was running from. She'd been asked once by the program director who'd recruited her why she'd applied. She'd been 21, working 2 jobs, her mother newly diagnosed, her brother in high school. It hadn't made obvious sense. She'd said, because someone has to be the person who runs toward it, and it might as well be someone who knows how. The director had looked at her for a long time and then said, "That's either the healthiest or the unhealthiest motivation I've ever heard for this work." She still didn't know which one he'd meant. The phone rang twice. A voice answered, cautious, recognizing her number with an intake of breath that told her everything she needed to know about whether this call was a surprise. "I know," she said, "and now you know I know. So let's talk about what happens next." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, slowly, carefully, the person who had burned her cover began to speak, and Bryn Callahan stood on a wet Vancouver sidewalk at 2 a.m. and listened and planned and waited for the moment when catching things her whole life would finally start to mean something that lasted longer than a single night.